All right, guys, day two. This looks a little bit more level than the World War II overview. Today we're going to talk about the origins of the Cold War and how the defensive alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries, came to be, and the Cold War flashpoints in places like, Berlin and Korea and Vietnam are going to be created. And so, throughout World War II, the Western world had worked very hard in the first part of the 20th century to move towards peace. That was the overarching goal. And in 1941, even before the United States enters World War II, several Western countries met in Canada to form what will become known as the Atlantic Charter. And what it did is that it took ideas from Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan of peace way back in World War I to try and get this world-lasting peace. And so Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had, through World War II, formed a successful military alliance to defeat Germany and the Axis powers. And it was hoped that there was a positive sentiment of goodwill that was going to last throughout the 20th century. Well, that clearly doesn't happen. Joseph Stalin wanted to keep the occupied parts of Europe that he had achieved in his alliance with Adolf Hitler several years beforehand. And the war was still going on. So the Allies are going to agree to deal with political problems later on. Right? We don't have time to worry about this now. We'll punt and deal with it later. But by late 1944, after the breakout of France, right before the Battle of the Bulge, the Soviets had pushed Germany out of the Soviet Union and back into Eastern Europe. The Soviet army was able to gobble up this territory very fast. Countries like Hungary and Poland and Romania, which the Soviet Union had been trying to gain control of for many years. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin began to talk about how they would divide up southeastern Europe, the Balkans, when the war was over. Now, this area had always been a trouble spot, but the United States would not sign off on this. And without the U.S. approval, they could not go forward. The United States did not want to divide Europe into spheres of influence. And so as World War II ends, the United States emerges as the lone superpower due to nuclear technology. And Germany will be divided, Berlin, the capital, will be divided into spheres of influence, 4 of them. 1 for each of the Allies, the American, a British, a French, and a Soviet zone. On top of all this, Germany is once again going to be forced to pay reparations payments to nearly 20 billion German marks. And the big question is, Eastern Europe, what's going to happen there? The Allies felt that the Soviets should have friendly neighbors. You should have people that you like who live next to you. But the Western Allies wanted these countries to be democratic and independent. Joseph Stalin did not feel that this was good for the Soviet Union. In his own, narcissistic paranoia, prevented him from believing the Allies were being honest with him. So very quickly, at the end of World War II, Stalin will go back on many of the arguments he made before the war ended. Alliances crumble, and the world will be split into 2 camps or spheres. One will be led by the United States, will become known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The other one will be known as the Warsaw Pact, or the Iron Curtain. It will be a Soviet-led empire or, alliance bent against the spread of capitalism, while the NATO is hell-bent on stopping the spread of communism. Now, when it's all said and done, the United States at first emerges as the lone superpower with nuclear technology. And all the blue countries here are going to be countries that will join NATO. There's a whole bunch of them running from Canada, the United States, most of Western Europe, even Turkey. However, when this is all done, the United States and the Soviet Union are the only two major powers left standing after victory was achieved. Both countries have vast economic resources and mobilized militaries strong enough to dominate the globe. But very quickly, these two allies become bitter enemies, bitter rivals, I should say, as their opposing economic and political ideologies just don't work with each other. Neither one could trust the other. And so after World War II, a new struggle is going to grow that will shape the events of most of the rest of the 20th century. It becomes simply known as the Cold War, a consistent, constant state of tension and sometimes outright hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, it's called the Cold War because the United States and the Soviets never directly fight each other. They use smaller proxy countries, all right? The two never engaged in combat or square off. And so here it is on March 5th in Westminster College in Missouri. Prime Minister Winston Churchill will give his now famous speech, where he says, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the great capitals and ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. And so now it is this term, the Iron Curtain, that will come to symbolize the Cold War. Western propaganda uses it to show the evil specter of communism spreading its influence and the West's growing fear of it. And so in its early stages, the Iron Curtain, or the main focus of the Cold War, will center over Eastern Europe. Stalin will have two goals in mind. Number one, he wanted friendly neighbors so he could spread communism to all of his Eastern European neighbors. And two, he wants a buffer, a safety net between him and the other capitalistic countries. He wanted like-minded governments to give him protection in case Germany should attack him for the third time that century. So as the Red Army defeats the Nazi forces and pushes them out of Europe, Stalin leaves behind an army to occupy that conquered territory. Stalin wanted to heavily influence this territory and impose his political and economic ideas. The United States and Great Britain will bitterly yell, scream, and complain, but the Soviet Union says, well, you didn't ask us when you concluded your own peace with Japan. And Stalin says, well, yeah, you didn't consult with us when you occupied Italy after the war. What we're doing is no different. And the Western powers say no. Number one, you didn't assist us in Japan or in Italy. And number two, concluding peace is something altogether different than leaving behind an occupying force. Now, Stalin will say that he is going to help allow so-called democratic elections. But quickly he doesn't do this. The Soviet army and local communists, especially in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary, will quickly dominate and beat down any opposing forces. While all that is going on, in April in Muir Woods outside San Francisco, 51 countries meet to draft the modern United Nations Charter. It's going to be the League of Nations, but better. There will be a General Assembly. Think of it as the House of Representatives, where each member country gets one member and one vote. There will also be a combination Senate and Supreme Court known as the Security Council. It will have 5 permanent members: the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. Every other country will get a chance, as 10 others will rotate every 3 years. The problem is the 5 permanent members have veto power over each other. So if the Soviets do something that England and the United States doesn't like, they can veto it. When they do something the Soviets don't like, the Soviets can veto it as well. Now, the UN takes a lot of heat for not being very effective, but they do have some good things, like the World Health Organization trying to stamp out diseases, the World Bank, which loans money to third world countries. They're trying to help. There's just an awful lot of problems problems that have been caused throughout the years, and it's tough to overcome them quickly. They're trying to prevent disease, keep refugees safe, help educational movements, help equality, build economies. But the Cold War is going to hurt this effort. And part of it is due to the arms race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union weaponized themselves, they armed themselves to the tooth. They built not only conventional weapons like, tanks and planes and jeeps, but other things like nuclear weapons to withstand an attack by the other. And over a 40-year period, the two countries will spend crazy sums of money developing nuclear and conventional weapons. And so, for most of the second half of the 20th century, a balance of power was maintained by a balance of terror, what becomes known as mutual assured destruction. And a lot of this will come as a result of what is known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine and the containment policy. President Truman saw communist ideology as like a creeping evil force slowly spreading across the world. He was much different from the isolationist presidents like Woodrow Wilson after World War I. Truman wants to take a leading role in global affairs as the one, superpower left. And so he will respond to the threat of communism, and on March 12, 1947, he issues the Truman Doctrine and its essential piece known as the containment policy. And it says that the United States must support free people of the world who are trying to resist attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, meaning communist. Places like Turkey and Greece were among the first to receive American aid. Truman says the free people of the world look to the United States for leadership. So he says he will resist the expansion of communism. It can exist where it is, but he will not allow it to spread. And so the containment policy is to put up a wall, to limit the spread of communism. And this is something that will guide our foreign policy for the next 30, 40, 50 years. An American economist, George Kennan, is one of the advisors on the containment policy, and he says that communism is simple. It cannot sustain itself. All right? He said, with patience and a firm hand, communism will eventually fail. It will not exist long term. So Joseph Stalin, however, will view the containment policy as an attack. And the Soviet Union and its communist allies were surrounded by the evil capitalists of Western Europe. And this shows up very quickly with something known as the Marshall Plan. Immediately after World War II, several things made communist ideas appealing for Western Europe. It was damaged by years of fighting and conflict. And the two biggest things driving it were poverty and hunger. So to prevent the democratic governments of Europe from collapsing, United States Secretary of State George C. Marshall will create and offer a massive aid package in terms of money, food, construction equipment to help rebuild the damaged parts of Europe. Literally, tons of food and billions of dollars are sent to help Western Europe rebuild from warfare to Western and Central Europe. This allows those areas to recover much more quickly than anybody thought possible. And as a result, the United States earns the goodwill of all of these countries. And they were willing to follow the lead of the democratic United States. President Truman also approved the offer of the Marshall Plan to areas in Eastern Europe as well, to Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. However, Joseph Stalin forbid them to accept this aid, saying that it is a capitalistic ruse, promising that it was his responsibility and he was going to help them recover. And so this is where we get the first big test, all right? And that is Germany. It is divided between an Eastern Germany, which was communist dominated, and Western Germany, which was allied. And inside the communist part is the city of Berlin, which, as I said, was divided into four spheres. The country of Germany is divided capitalist and Eastern communist. And in Berlin, the wall goes up. And so Germany becomes a major flashpoint of the Cold War. The Soviet Union either took apart factories from Germany or destroyed them during the war. They were afraid of a newly regenerated Germany. So inside Berlin, there are 4 zones, some of them controlled and monitored by the United States, Great Britain, and France. They help West Berlin and West Germany rebuild their infrastructure, their economy, and their industry. And so West Germany will be democratic. It will have a democratic constitution. It was allowed to govern itself, and it received a massive Western aid package. Western Germany will very quickly become an industrial power. East Germany, on the other hand, was governed by a communist government that had its policies dictated by Moscow. And so here it comes. The first flashpoint is known as the Berlin Airlift. In 1948, Joseph Stalin tried to push the Allies out of Berlin by sealing off all the access points to the city. He cuts off the roads, the bridges, the railroads, and the people there were stuck. Well, the Allied army was still there. So the U.S. Air Force simply loads up packages of food and medicine and supplies, and they fly over Berlin and drop them by parachute around the clock. Seeing that he couldn't lay siege and starve them out, Stalin backs off. But he is embarrassed, and this leads to a deepening of the hostility between the former allies. And so here we go. Shortly after the Truman Doctrine is written down and the crisis over Berlin ends, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is developed. It builds on that Atlantic Charter, where we get countries like the United States and Canada, Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, Norway, all agree to send a form of aid. There are 11 original members, and what they say is, if any of them are attacked by the Soviet Union or a country over Soviet influence, the other 10 countries will jump in and help out. In response to that, the Soviet Union will form its own military alliance in the 1950s known as the Warsaw Pact, where 7 Eastern European countries, all right, called Soviet satellites, will jump in. They pledge that if any one of them are attacked by a Western capitalist country, the others would come to their aid. In the eyes of most people, the big difference between NATO and the Warsaw Pact is that the NATO members were volunteered to join the alliance, while the Warsaw Pact countries were dominated by the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was a tool to control these countries and force them to follow the commands coming from the Soviet Politburo in Moscow. And so, as the Cold War is going to progress, both sides will justify their position by that arms race I talked about earlier. The United States says that containment policy, containing communism, defending democracy is all important. That the Soviet Union says that the proletariat, the common people, were constantly fighting against the corrupt capitalists who were bent on keeping them poor. Underneath this, both were trying to secure power around the globe. It was their job. It is what they were doing. It's what each side was trying to further its own ideas, its own ideology. They can say they weren't, but that's pretty much what was going down. So, as they fight for power around the globe, the Soviet Union and the United States, as I said, did not directly attack each other. But the hostility between the two will spill over into smaller tertiary battles, all right, in areas like Korea, in areas like Vietnam, Cambodia, is where all of this is going to eventually play out. It is a nasty battle that will last through most of the 20th century. Both will siphon off resources. However, the United States had an economy that was able to sustain this, while the Soviet Union had a much more difficult time supporting their economy, which helps lead to its eventual collapse. In the middle of all this, we have another major important factor, and that is the creation of the country of Israel. In 1948, the State of Israel is created by England to give the people of the Jewish people of Europe a homeland in Palestine. They were devastated by the Holocaust and things that went on in World War II. So they are going to get a homeland in what is today Israel. The only problem is the British just make this up. They never asked the existing Arab people how they felt about this. The United Nations is going to quickly form and sign a resolution allowing this to happen. Everyone thought it was a pretty good idea, except the people who were already living there. So, the existing Arab states refused to accept this resolution, which turned part of Palestine into a half Arab, half Jewish country. So in 1948, the Jewish people in Palestine claim that they are the new independent state or country of Israel. They are immediately recognized by the United States. When the United States recognizes the existence of the modern country of Israel, Israel now exists. A current country has to recognize the existence of a new one for it to belong. Well, the United States recognizes Israel, so now Israel is there. And so, immediately, the Arabic states around there, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, are all going to attack Israel. They will lose. And as is customary of the time, if you attack me and I defeat you, I'm going to want a buffer zone. I'm going to want protection between me and you, so I get to take some of your stuff. All right, I want to see you coming at me. Since the late 40s, there has been a state of armed truce and even open warfare between the Arab nations and the Palestinians. Many do not want Israel to exist. Since the United States recognized the existence of Israel, we have been a long-time ally, and therefore have given a lot of money and weapons and have taken aggressive measures to make sure Israel stays untouched, stays whole. In 1956, there is a war with Egypt, and Egypt loses. In 1967, there is known as the June War, where several countries attacked Israel. They made initial gains, and after day 3 and 4, the Israelis began to push back. So Israel will capture Sinai and the Golan Heights and what is the West Bank. Things you see about in the news. As Israel grows with technology and industry, some of the others don't have it. In 1973, Israel is attacked by Egypt again. Each time, Israel wins. In between this time, there is like acts of terrorism. The Arabic people will be displaced. They will be shoved out. And as like cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem grows strong, some of the other, how do we say it? The local citizens are made to feel second class. All right, they just simply do not like the way they are being treated, and so this will give rise to what is known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO will be a major sticking point. And this is what will continue for a very, very long time. During the 1960s, many Palestinians began to resist what they saw as Israeli domination. The PLO will be headed by a guy named Yasser Arafat. And he will enjoy widespread support from Palestinians who wanted Israel destroyed. And as we talked about in the 1960s and 70s, there is a series of attacks on the Israeli homeland, Israelis abroad, the most famous being the hijacking of an Israeli plane in 1968, and then the killing of Israeli Olympic athletes in 1972. As the military portion of the PLO continues to fight against Israel, the Israelis responded by attacking bases in Palestinian towns. The Israelis also will cross the border and go into Lebanon to destroy PLO strongholds. By the late 1980s, a new wing of the PLO, known as the Intifada or Uprising, a movement led by many young teenage Palestinians, took to protesting and demonstrations. They disobeyed curfews, they yelled at Israeli soldiers, and the Israelis quickly cracked down. So this was a long time, we'll get to it in a later chapter, period of tension between the two areas. And then we get to the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. And in 1978, President Jimmy Carter will invite Anwar Sadat and his Israeli counterpart, Prime Minister, I always mispronounce this, Menachem Begin, to come to the presidential retreat at Camp David in Maryland. And there, as they were shielded from reporters and busybodies for nearly 2 weeks, they sit down, and in 1978 they will come up with the Camp David Peace Accords, which was the first agreement between an Arabic country and Israel. This included rights for the Palestinian citizens and the removal of Israeli soldiers from territory that Israel captured back in the 1967 June War. However, many Arabic countries and their leaders were angry at the Camp David peace accords, and in 1981 Anwar Sadat is assassinated. The new president, Hosni Mubarak, however, kept the peace treaty, and things are still tense in that area of the world as we speak. All right. More recently, you hear about this a lot, the tensions between North and South Korea, and I spent a little bit of time up near the DMZ. And the Korean War is the first flashpoint during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to, pick a side in the Korean War, with the Soviet Union backing the North and South Korea being backed by the United States, and even China is going to get involved. And the people of the Korean Peninsula are the same culturally. They have the same language, the same history, heritage, They eat the same foods. And the Korean people, as I said, are this homogenous group of people, but they quickly become divided after World War II, a division that lasts to this very day. The United States and the Soviet Union will agree to a temporary split along the 38th parallel. The United States and its allies, its forces, will control the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, while the Soviets occupy the northern half. The division will become permanent after North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung becomes an ally of the Soviet Union. Now, this is exactly what the Truman Doctrine was written to prevent. The United States backed South Korean leader Syngman Rhee. And there is this palpable tension and hostility that will last until 1950, when North Korea and communist forces invade the South. It was the goal of North Korea to occupy and unify the entire country of Korea. This is what their job was. The Allied forces were sent reeling back to the port of Busan when the United Nations, was able to organize a defense led by United States war hero General Douglas MacArthur. He was given the task of commanding the international troops. MacArthur coordinates a risky landing at this little place called the Incheon. He gets behind communist forces and begins to push them back. Slowly, the United Nations pushed North Korea back across the 38th parallel into North Korea, where Doug MacArthur was told to stop. He was ordered to stop. However, he doesn't do this. He pushes too far into North Korea. He was told not to do it because we did not want to upset communist China leader Mao Zedong. Well, MacArthur goes ahead and does it anyway. Well, the Chinese communist forces come in, they enter the battle, and the United Nations forces are pushed back to the 38th parallel, where everything began, where the DMZ will happen. In April of 1951, an armistice was created, and in 1953, after 3 years of war, the line is divided. It stays exactly how it was before the war began. At this moment, it is the largest demilitarized zone, or DMZ, in the world. There is millions of landmines. North Korean troops line the northern side, and thousands of troops from the Republic of Korea and the United States are on the southern side. It means a state of warfare that started in 1950 and continues to this very day. After the war, North and South Korea follow two totally different paths. North Korea will be run by a totalitarian government. and they will remain with an economy that is strictly communistic, and it is failing. After World War II, both were rebuilt after Japanese occupation, but South Korea will leap ahead during the 1960s. International loans come in with capitalism. They begin to build, not only just clothing, but electronics, automobiles, Hyundai, Kia. They are a major, what is called Asian tiger, a major economy in the world today, while in North Korea it's completely different. In the South, while getting the corporation started, workers were told, hey, you're going to work long hours, we're not going to be able to pay you very much, but as time goes on, we are going to increase your salaries. So the salaries grew along with the business. It builds loyalty, and by the 90s, South Korea is known as an Asian tiger, a major economic powerhouse. Kim Il-sung, on the other hand, will try Stalin-era communism with government-owned factories and farms. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Here is a look at, Seoul, South Korea, a modern major city of 23 million people, and here are the slums and the shacks of North Korea. Kim Il-sung said that the nation must sing with a single tune. And by the 60s, he said that North Korea will be self-reliant. They will not need anybody else. And he alienates not only the Soviet Union, but China by saying that they had deviated from what communism is. And so they bail on him. And by the 1980s, all other communist countries had undergone some type of reform except North Korea. They were trying to get a nuclear weapons program going, but things are not going well, and we see the problems with them to this very day. The second Cold War flashpoint happens in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba had achieved its independence, existing in a sphere of American influence. Now, the Cuban government enjoyed having the United States very, very close, but the Cuban government was not very well run. The leaders of Cuba were either widely corrupt or just unable to look after the welfare of their citizens. And so by the 1940s, with the United States economically dominating the government, backing many corrupt and ineffective leaders, some student groups were angry at their lack of progress. So they began to protest the governmental leadership. Leading the country at the time was United States-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. And Batista's leadership was not only ineffective, but widely corrupt as well. So bad that in 1953, university students began to attack Batista's governmental barracks. Leading this on July 26, 1953, so it's known as the July 26th movement, is a young guy named Fidel Castro. And Castro and his men get driven back into the jungles, and they keep up a guerrilla war for a couple years. By 1956, Castro and his followers are strong enough to attack Batista's government. And on New Year's Eve, 1958, Batista is sent fleeing the country. This is a famous moment. It's even put in the classic film Godfather 2. And Castro, in January of 1959, will arrive in the Cuban capital of Havana as this new victorious revolutionary leader. And he is elected the new president of Cuba. It is at this point that he was in power Castro began to take a communist slant in his ideology. He begins the most widespread overhauling, the most extensive political, economic, and social reforms ever in Latin American history. He wants to overhaul the entire country and rebuild Cuba politically, socially, and economically from the ground up. As a result, democracies are great, but guys, it's much better if I just tell you what to do. Castro opposed any form of democracy. He didn't like Batista's dictatorship. His will be much better. Castro thought it was better for him to rule in an authoritative manner. It would get things done more quickly. So this is the way he rules for about 10 years. And in 1970, Castro will create a cabinet, a group of advisors, people like his brother Raul, that are going to help him. He's still the head of the government, the unquestioned leader, but Castro wanted to try a land redistribution program to give some land back to the peasants. He wants to improve Cuba's agricultural output, especially the crops of tobacco and sugar. The only problem is, Castro runs into the same problem that plagued Russia going back to Peter the Great and Vladimir Lenin and Stalin. All right, everything was done as fast as possible. They were at warp speed. All right, speed was more important than output. Problem is, nobody knew what they were supposed to be doing. It's great to think about it, but the concept is much different than the implementation. So the results were not very good. No one in the government, not the leaders or the farmers, had any training or knowledge on how to lead a project this large. Fearing a collapse, the Soviet Union steps in. They thought it would be funny to get an ally this close to the United States. And they provide Castro with large cash subsidies. These are going to keep Castro in power. And the Soviets will use Cuba as a propaganda tool, as well as a way to keep an eye on their enemy, the United States. The Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries promise to be major trading partners with Cuba. Well, this will lead to a series of conflicts. As a result of Castro's aligning Cuba with the Soviet Union, the United States government will view Cuba now as a communist threat. President Kennedy does not like this. So in 1961, the United States will gather up exiled Cubans that fled or were kicked out of the country, that they were going to invade it with their goal is to get rid of the Fidel Castro regime and government. They would then install a pro-American democracy. And this event is known as the Bay of Pigs. It was an attack plan that should have been an easy victory for the United States, but it was poorly planned and even more poorly executed, and it's an embarrassing failure in front of the world audience. The United States government, not only did they not topple Castro, but they increased the hostility and tension between the two countries as well. Also, three countries. I might as well throw in the Soviet Union. It was the low point of President Kennedy's career. Then 1 year later, we get a thing known as 13 days, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a time, my dad was in the Army at this time, he talks about it, that the world was closer to nuclear war, to mutually assured destruction than any other time in world history. When the Bay of Pigs invasion solidified Castro's relationship with the Soviet Union, the Soviets jump on this. They want to make the United States look even worse. So they got Cuba to agree to allow them to place nuclear missile batteries, launch pads, inside Cuba 90 miles from the United States. The United States government and President Kennedy just could not let this happen. They were not only terrified, but angry as well. Acting on this threat, President Kennedy will set up a blockade around Cuba. No ships were allowed to enter or leave Cuba, especially those from the Soviet Union. And President Kennedy and the United States government demanded that the Soviet Union admit to having nuclear weapons in Cuba and immediately remove them. During 13 days in 1962, the world readied itself for war. Not only was it possible, but it was most likely. In the end, the blockade works, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the man who took over for Joseph Stalin, backs down, and he agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the United States removing missiles from Turkey. The United States also had to promise not to overthrow Castro's government in Cuba. And so, the crisis will eventually pass. The Soviet communist ideology has a foothold in the American sphere of influence. And Castro had promised the Soviet Union that he would send troops to different parts of Latin America to help spread their ideology. The only problem is, when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, Castro is stuck. He no longer had an ally. The Soviet Union was pumping millions of dollars into Cuba, and they got no return. When Castro finds himself without these resources, he doesn't know what to do. And so with communism failing around the world, Cuba was the only old-school Soviet bloc state that had not reformed. Now recently there have been many changes. Castro has died. We're opening up tourism. Carnival Cruise goes down there now. Tourism is opening. And with Marxism discredited, Cuba is going to collapse their communist ideology in the very near future. Here's one of my favorite political cartoons with President Kennedy and Khrushchev arm wrestling, sitting on nuclear missiles, and you can see Khrushchev really beginning to strain and sweat. All right, here's where we may have to take a little break. Another Cold War flashpoint known as Vietnam. We'll try and push on and finish this one here, trying to keep these to an hour. During the age of imperialism in the 1800s, Vietnam in Southeast Asia is going to be claimed by France. And the leader of the communist forces, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, actually fought in World War I. And he was at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And during World War II, Ho Chi Minh will help lead forces against Japanese occupation. And so after World War II, there was a large nationalist movement, an independence movement going on inside Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh controlled much of the north and was a well-known figure amongst his people. Well, unfortunately, things get complicated during the Cold War, as in 1946, the French wanted to regain their empire in Vietnam, which was called French Indochina. However, the nationalists in Vietnam did not want to be ruled by France. They did not want any Europeans to come in and capture their empires. And so Ho Chi Minh is going to take over. All right. Now the problem with this part of Southeast Asia, well, Ho Chi Minh has massive support of the peasant people, that they really have no governmental experience. And the problem here is there's always instability. There are many different linguistic and language groups inside Vietnam. And this regional and ethnic tension hurts their attempts at modernization. Plus, there was a long period of war. It was fighting the occupation of the Japanese, and then fighting the French. And then it turns into fighting with the United States in a civil war. People, you could be born and be 30 years old and know nothing but war. And so here we go. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to interfere with Vietnam's quest for independence. The Truman Doctrine and the containment policy wanted to stop the spread of communism. Now, the United States didn't mind new countries becoming independent as long as they were not communist. So, all across Southeast Asia, we have countries who want to modernize. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, but again, they lacked experience. They had those ethnic and regional conflicts. They really didn't know what was going on, and they find themselves trapped as unwilling participants in the Cold War. And so after Vietnam will defeat the French in 1954, they thought things were going well until they embroiled in a battle between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And so at a conference in Switzerland, the United States and the Soviet Union decide to a temporary split, just like they had done in Korea, along the 17th parallel. The United States will back South Vietnamese leader, a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, and in North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho here, is going to be the major personality and leader of the government. So there's Ngo Dinh Diem. Here we go. Other nations like Laos and Cambodia became fully independent. And this agreement calls for Vietnam to hold free elections by 1956 to see if they could reunite the country. Do the people want to be run by a communist government or a Western democratic leadership? And both sides began talking. The problem with elections is that you might lose. And so there was a new theory known as the domino theory. It has nothing to do with the game or the pizza company, but it said there's a little bit of humor there. If one country falls to communism, it will domino and knock down all the others. So, when concerned with losing the election to the communists, we simply do not allow that to happen. And this kicks in the second phase of the war. First it was with the French, now it's a civil war and a war with the United States. So, Ho Chi Minh will lead from 1959 to 1975. And he wanted Vietnam to be reunited to one single country. So he begins to nurture and cultivate support for communism with citizens in the South known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were trying to overthrow the democratic government. So to make sure that President Dim's government doesn't go away, the United States will send in just a massive aid package, billions of dollars of money and supplies, and then military aid and advisors. In the 1960s, President Kennedy will expand U.S. involvement throughout his term in office. After his assassination, President Johnson does the same thing. And so a tiny local problem becomes a major conflict. More and more and more soldiers are sent to battle the communists. All right, nearly 500,000 will be sent during the Vietnam War. In 1964, there was a massive bombing campaign. If the Viet Cong are hiding in the jungles, we will blow up the jungles and defoliate the jungles, and then they will have nowhere to hide. This was the plan. However, even with the overwhelming number of supplies, the United States just couldn't get at the Viet Cong because they were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Ho Chi Minh will receive help from the Soviets in terms of weapons and supplies, but no Soviet troops were sent. Okay. So no matter what the United States sent to South Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and his soldiers proved very, very difficult to defeat. And so by the early 70s, with, 58,000 Americans killed, the opinion begins to swing against the war. President Nixon, who was a criminal but a very good foreign policy president, arranges a ceasefire and negotiates a treaty in 1973. The South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell. This is a famous picture of the last group of people from our embassy boarding a helicopter before it falls and is then renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh's success was very similar to that which brought Mao Zedong to power in China. He was a popular fellow that led guerrilla victories against the powerful Japanese, the powerful French, and the United States. Ho Chi Minh's new government begins to recover from the destruction and from 30 years of constant warfare. However, with harsh sanctions imposed because they were communist, the government has once again no idea how to run. It is very inefficient. It is mired in poverty, and just only recently has beginning to turn the corner, welcoming foreign investment. Vietnam wants to become the South Korea of Southeast Asia. There are now direct flights from the United States, and things are looking up, looking much better for Vietnam. This brings us to our last stop, and that is Cambodia. There they have a leader named Pol Pot, who's the leader of a communist government known as the Khmer Rouge. And he overthrows the government. Cambodians who believed in communist ideology will overthrow their government and set up a new one. This is all led by Pol Pot, who is supposed to be a communist leader, but instead he goes crazy and he leads a killing spree like Maximilien Robespierre in the French Revolution. He sees Western technology as evil. It's almost like the Taliban, right? He wants to erase all remnants of Western ideology and culture from his country. And he saw that living in a city, urbanization was a form of Western influence and corruption. So he forces his own urban citizens out of the cities, and they're going to go outside and they are going to farm. He relocates them to work in agricultural jobs. Problem is, nobody knows how to do this. There's not seed, there's not fertilizer, there's not tools. So millions die from starvation. Those who complained or did not work hard enough, however that was defined, were executed. Some estimates place the deaths in Cambodia at over 1 million. By 1979, things had become so bad in Cambodia that Vietnam had to invade to save the citizens. If you go there today and you see the sign, please stay on the trail, there are millions of landmines still there that are being taken apart. It was one of Princess Diana's UN initiatives to detonate them. Beautiful country, a lot of good things, but when they say stay on the trail, stay on the trail. United Nations peacekeepers were brought in. They had to remain vigilant against attacks from the Khmer Rouge, and the situation in Cambodia is still not good to this very day. So in the end, we have several historical flashpoints, primarily in Asia, that will define the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. United States fighting to stop the spread of communism, while the Soviet Union wants to encourage it. And once again, while the two nations do not directly fight each other, their thirst and quest for dominance causes death and destruction for many people around the world. The one-time allies continue to be at odds until, as George Kennan predicted with patience and a firm hand, the Soviet Union will collapse in December of 1991. All right, we did it in an hour. All right, next topic coming.